The head chef at Hargrove Fine Dining laughed so hard he had to set down his knife. It was the kind of laugh that fills a kitchen, sharp, dismissive, the sort that bounces off stainless steel and lingers long after the sound stops. The man who caused it was standing near the service entrance, a faded canvas jacket, holding a paper bag that smelled faintly of motor oil and cumin. He had driven 40 minutes from the east side of Cincinnati to answer a job listing for a prep cook position. He was 43 years old, visibly tired, and his hands looked like they had spent decades doing something harder than slicing vegetables. His name was Brett Calloway, and the chef who laughed at him had no idea what he had just dismissed. The kitchen manager later said Brett had introduced himself quietly, mentioned he had some culinary experience, and asked if the position was still available. The head chef, a man named Dominic who had trained in Lyon and never let anyone forget it, looked Brett up and down once, and said the kitchen wasn't hiring charity cases. Someone snickered near the grill station. Someone else turned back to their cutting board. Brett picked up his paper bag, nodded once like he had expected exactly this, and walked back out through the service entrance without another word. Nobody in that kitchen realized that the man they just sent away had once cooked a private dinner for a sitting senator, that he had developed a sauce reduction technique still used, without credit, by 2 restaurants that now carried Michelin stars, that he had written a culinary proposal at 31 that food critics called visionary, before life collapsed underneath him and took everything he had built with it. But that part of the story comes later. First you need to understand what brought Brett Calloway to a service entrance on a Tuesday afternoon, with a paper bag and nowhere else to be. 6 years before that kitchen, Brett had a restaurant of his own. It wasn't large. 32 seats, exposed brick, a chalkboard menu that changed every week, depending on what the farmer's market had available. He called it Groundwork. His wife Renata had come up with the name during the first week they signed the lease, sitting on the floor of the empty dining room, eating takeout from the Thai place next door, laughing about how insane it was to spare savings on a restaurant in a neighborhood still figuring out what it wanted to be. Renata wasn't in the industry. She taught 3rd grade, stayed up late grading papers at the same table where Brett tested new recipes, and had an opinion about every dish that was almost always right. She was the first person Brett fed anything he cooked, and her face told him everything before she said a word. When she smiled slowly, not the polite smile, the slow one that started in her eyes, he knew he had something. Groundwork did well from the beginning, not explosively, not in the way food media covers overnight sensations, but steadily, honestly. Regulars came back twice a month. A reviewer from a regional food magazine called it quietly extraordinary. Brett hired 2 line cooks, a dishwasher named Percy, who had been with him since the first week, and a front-of-house manager named Greta, who ran the dining room, like she was personally offended by empty tables. His son Jake was 7 when Groundwork opened. He did homework on a corner stool near the prep station after school, while Brett cooked, occasionally sneaking bites of whatever was being tested that evening. Jake called himself the official taster. Brett gave him a small notepad, and told him to write down his opinions in it, which Jake did with extreme seriousness, even when his handwriting was still uneven, and his notes mostly said things like good, but needs more bread. For 4 years, this was their life. Imperfect, busy, never quite financially comfortable, but full. Then Renata got sick, the diagnosis came fast, and the prognosis came faster. A form of aggressive leukemia that her oncologist explained with careful measured language that Brett would later only remember in fragments. Treatment options, timelines, probabilities. He sat in that office and understood almost nothing, except that the woman who ate takeout on the floor with him, and named their restaurant, and made the slow smile that told him when something was good, she was in serious danger. Brett closed Groundwork 3 months later, not because he wanted to, because Renata's treatment required someone present, available, consistent, and he could not run a restaurant and be that person at the same time. He tried for 6 weeks to manage both, leaving the kitchen in Greta's Hansen's during hospital appointments, coming back smelling like antiseptic, and pretending he was focused. His line cooks covered for him. Percy washed dishes without being asked on his days off. But Brett knew what was happening. He wasn't running a restaurant anymore. He was performing the idea of one, while his real life was happening somewhere else. He closed it quietly, settled the lease, paid his staff 2 months ahead, and gave Percy the good knife set. Renata died 14 months after the diagnosis. Jake was 11. The medical debt took what the restaurant closure left behind. The house they had owned for 6 years went back to the bank. Brett found a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of Cincinnati where the rent was manageable and the neighbors were quiet. And he and Jake moved into it with 2 carloads of belongings. And the kind of silence between them that happens when grief is too large for either person to address directly. Brett took whatever work he could find, catering jobs, a temporary position at a hotel kitchen doing breakfast service, a brief stint consulting for a chain restaurant that wanted to elevate their menu, which in practice meant suggesting small improvements that were ignored and collecting a check that barely covered utilities. His name in the culinary world, the name that had once meant something, had gone quiet. People forget quickly in this industry. New restaurants open, new chefs emerge, and the ones who disappear for a year or two during personal catastrophe tend to stay disappeared. He didn't complain about this. He packed Jake's lunches in the morning, helped with homework at night, and cooked dinner every evening on a stove that had one burner that ran slightly hot. He found a certain honesty in cooking on bad equipment, in a small kitchen with no audience. The food was still good, it was always still good. Nobody was watching, which somehow made it easier. Jake, now 12, had his father's habit of quiet observation. He watched Brett cook with the same focused attention Brett had watched him do homework with years earlier, not interfering, just present. On weekends, Brett let him help, not in the instructional, deliberate way of a parent teaching a skill. More like the way 2 people who have been through the same hard thing find comfort in doing something ordinary together. Those evenings were the best part of the week. Hargrove Fine Dining had been in downtown Cincinnati for 11 years. It was the kind of establishment that served as the city's culinary benchmark. The place where anniversaries were celebrated, where business deals were sealed over tasting menus, where visiting dignitaries were taken when someone needed to make an impression. It was owned by a woman named Victoria Hargrove, who had inherited the restaurant from her father, James, a celebrated self-taught chef, who had built the place from a 16-seat bistro into one of the most respected dining rooms in the Midwest. James Hargrove had died 2 years earlier. Heart attack, sudden, 3 days after returning from a culinary conference in Chicago, where people who had known him for decades said he seemed healthy and energized, and already planning next season's menu. His death left Victoria with a restaurant to run, a legacy to protect, and a grief she managed by being exceptionally competent at things that could be controlled and silently devastated by the things that couldn't. Victoria was 46. She had a background in finance, not food. She understood the business of the restaurant, the numbers, the contracts, the vendor relationships. What she did not understand, what she had always left to her father, was the soul of it. The reason people drove across the city on a Tuesday night and felt something when they left. James had carried that understanding in his hands, in the way he moved through the kitchen, in recipes that were partly written down and partly intuition, accumulated over 40 years of cooking. The kitchen staff respected Victoria, but didn't always trust her decisions. She had promoted Dominic to head chef after her father's death, because Dominic was technically excellent, and had tenure. What she hadn't fully accounted for was that Dominic cooked with precision, and not much else. The food was correct, elegant, impressive, and somehow no longer moving. 2 longtime regulars had quietly mentioned it to the front desk. A review in a regional publication noted that Hargrove had maintained its standard, but seemed to have lost some ineffable quality it once possessed. Victoria had read that sentence 7 times and didn't know how to fix it. She had also spent the past 18 months trying to recreate one specific dish. Her father's braised short rib, served with a celery root puree and a red wine reduction that James had spent 3 years refining. It had been the restaurant's signature dish for over a decade. James had written some of it down, but the written recipe was incomplete. The reduction, specifically, relied on a timing instinct and a flavor judgment that had never been fully documented. Every attempt since his death had produced something technically acceptable and experientially flat. Dominic had tried 6 times. 2 other experienced chefs had been brought in as consultants. Nobody had gotten it right. It felt to Victoria like another version of losing her father, like watching something irreplaceable slip away and not being able to stop it. She had quietly mentioned this to a vendor she trusted, who mentioned it to someone else, and word had traveled through the invisible network of people who know things about Cincinnati's food community. Nobody had a solution. Everyone agreed it was probably impossible to recover a dish built substantially on one person's uncaptured instinct. This was the situation when Brett Calloway came back. He hadn't planned to reach out to Hargrove. He had applied for the prep cook position because he needed income, and it was nearby, and the hours were compatible with Ch's school schedule. When Dominic laughed at him and the kitchen manager did nothing, Brett went back to his car and sat for a moment, and then drove to pick up Jake from soccer practice. Jake asked how it went. Brett said not great and put on the radio. Jake nodded and didn't push, which was one of the things Brett appreciated most about his son. It was Percy, his former dishwasher, now working part-time at a catering company that occasionally supplied events at Hargrove, who made the connection. Percy had stayed in touch with Brett over the years in the loose, easy way of people who respect each other without needing constant contact. He knew Brett's situation. He also knew, from a server he was friendly with at Hargrove, that Victoria Hargrove had been struggling for over a year with something specific in her kitchen. Percy texted Brett on a Thursday evening, "You know James Hargrove's cooking?" Brett texted back, "Studied every published piece he ever wrote." "Why?" Percy replied, "His daughter needs help. Like real help, you should reach out." Brett stared at that message for a long time. He was sitting at the kitchen table across from Jake, who was working through a geography assignment. The overhead light was doing that thing where it flickered slightly at irregular intervals. Brett had been meaning to replace the bulb for 3 weeks. He almost didn't send the email. He thought about Dominic's laugh. He thought about the investor who had told him after Renata died that the culinary world wasn't a good place for people who couldn't stay focused. He thought about the review that had once called him visionary, and how long ago that felt, and how much distance there was between who he had been and who he was now. Then Jake looked up from his homework and said, without context, "Dad, you should do the thing." Brett looked at him. "What thing?" "Whatever you're thinking about. You get that face when you're about to talk yourself out of something." Brett sent the email that night. Victoria read it twice, before calling the contact number at the bottom. The email was short. 4 sentences describing his background, a specific mention of James Hargrove's published writing on reduction technique, and why he believed the approach was recoverable, and a line at the end that said he wasn't looking for anything dramatic. Just a chance to try. She called him the next morning. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. She asked him 3 technical questions about reduction methodology, and he answered all 3 with a specificity that made her pause after each one. Not to think about the answer, to think about the fact that she was hearing it from someone she had never considered. She asked him to come in. Dominic was not informed in advance. Brett arrived at the restaurant on a Sunday morning when the kitchen was not in service. Before prep began, before staff arrived in full, Victoria met him at the back entrance. She showed him the written portion of her father's recipe. She showed him the 6 failed attempts, documented with Dominic's notes, which were meticulous and technical, and missed something fundamental that Brett identified within 2 minutes of reading them. The reduction wasn't a technique problem, it was a sequencing problem. James Hargrove had written the ingredients in the order he added them, but Dominic had read them as a list, not a timeline. One component, a small amount of aged sherry vinegar added at a specific late stage, was being incorporated 40 seconds too early. At high heat, those 40 seconds completely changed the acid profile. Brett didn't say this to be impressive. He said it the way he said most things, quietly and without decoration, standing at a prep counter looking at handwritten notes. Victoria looked at him. "You got that from the written recipe? From the notes on the failed attempts? The flavor descriptions your chef wrote? Sharp finish, flattened mid-palate, those are acid timing issues." She handed him an apron. He cooked in her kitchen for 4 hours that morning, while she watched from a stool near the expediting station. He didn't perform. He didn't explain what he was doing at every step. He cooked the way he cooked at home on Tuesday nights, for an audience of one 12-year-old who kept a notepad, with complete attention and no excess. When he placed the plate in front of her, Victoria picked up a fork and tasted the reduction. She set the fork down. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That's it. That's exactly what it was supposed to taste like." Her voice had something in it that hadn't been there during the clinical 11-minute phone call, or during the 2 hours she'd spent watching him work. Brett recognized it because he knew it from his own life. It was the sound of something coming back that a person had resigned themselves to losing. Word moved through the kitchen the way it always does. Fast, and slightly distorted by the time it reaches the last person. By the following week, the kitchen staff knew that a man had come in on Sunday and reproduced the short rib reduction on the first attempt. Dominic knew by Monday and said nothing publicly that could be quoted. But the atmosphere in the kitchen changed in the particular way kitchens change when someone's authority has been quietly challenged. Victoria offered Brett a position. Not prep cook. She offered him the title of culinary director, a role she was creating specifically to address what the restaurant had lost. Not the technical execution, which the current staff handled adequately, but the judgment, the intuition, the understanding of what the food was supposed to feel like to the person eating it. Brett asked for 24 hours to think about it. He went home, made dinner, and told Jake what had happened. Jake listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which took some effort, because Jake was fundamentally incapable of not interrupting when something interested him. When Brett finished, Jake said, "So they laughed at you and then they needed you, more or less, and now she wants to give you a real job." Jake was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dad, do you actually want it? Or do you just feel like you should want it because it's a good opportunity?" Brett didn't answer immediately. Which was itself an answer. He sat with the question the way he had learned to sit with the questions that mattered. Not rushing toward resolution, just letting the weight of it settle. "I want it," he said finally. "I'm just scared I've been away too long." Jake picked up his fork. "You made that sauce the first time. That doesn't sound like someone who's been away too long." What followed was not a perfect transition. Kitchens with established hierarchies do not restructure gracefully, and Brett's arrival in a leadership capacity created friction that was sometimes direct, and sometimes ambient. Dominic resisted in the careful, professional way of someone who understood that open conflict would be damaging, and so opted instead for small obstructions. Delayed communication, minor scheduling conflicts, the kind of passive management of information that makes a new person feel slightly unwelcome, without providing them any specific grievance to address. Brett had worked in enough kitchens to recognize this. He didn't fight it directly. What he did instead was work. He arrived earlier than anyone. He spent time with every station, not to supervise, but to understand what each cook was doing and why. He tasted everything with the same focused attention he brought to his own cooking. He asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than evaluative, and the line cooks, who had grown accustomed to Dominic's correction-first style, responded to this with something approaching relief. He also started rebuilding the menu incrementally, not overturning it. He had no interest in erasing what the restaurant had established. But James Hargrove had always treated the menu as a living thing, responsive to season, to what was excellent right now, to the ongoing dialogue between a kitchen and the people it fed. Under Dominic, the menu had calcified into something technically accomplished, but no longer responsive. Brett began the conversation again. Within 8 weeks, the dining room felt different. Staff who had been there for years said it quietly to each other, and to the servers, who said it to regulars, who started coming back more often. The food was doing what food at Hargrove used to do, making people feel something they couldn't fully articulate, and didn't need to. A reviewer from a national food publication came through in Brett's 3rd month. She had been to Hargrove twice before, under James's tenure. She stayed for 3 hours and ordered more courses than she typically did. Her review ran 6 weeks later. She wrote that the restaurant had undergone what she called an unmistakable renewal, and that whoever was responsible for the current direction understood something rare. That technical mastery in service of emotional resonance is entirely different from technical mastery alone. She didn't name Brett specifically. Victoria did, in a post on the restaurant's social media accounts the day the review ran, along with a brief account of how he had come to be there. She included the part about the service entrance. She included Dominic's response. She included the Sunday morning, when Brett reproduced a dish in a single attempt that the kitchen had been unable to recover for 18 months. The post was shared several thousand times by noon. Dominic resigned 4 days later. Brett did not celebrate this. He told Jake about it over dinner, and Jake asked what he felt about it, and Brett said mostly tired, and a little sad, and also that he hoped Dominic landed somewhere that suited him better. Jake wrote something in his notepad. The notepad he still kept for food notes, now filled with several years of increasingly sophisticated observations, and didn't show Brett what it said. Brett asked later. Jake turned the notepad around. He had written, "Dad says, I hope he lands somewhere better, this is why people trust him." Brett looked at that for a long moment and then handed the notepad back. Victoria Hargrove formally restructured Brett's role to include operational oversight of the kitchen, a significant increase in compensation, and, the part that meant the most to him, creative authority over a new section of the menu she called the Groundwork Series. A rotating selection of dishes built on the same principles Brett had applied at his original restaurant. Seasonal, honest, responsive, the kind of food that reminded people why eating together still mattered. The name was Victoria's suggestion. Brett hadn't told her about his restaurant. She found it in an old regional food feature from 9 years ago, sent him the link without comment, and said she thought the name deserved to exist again. He read that email standing in the Hargrove kitchen at 6 in the morning, before service prep began, surrounded by the sound of a kitchen coming awake, the ambient hiss of burners being tested, the rhythm of a knife on a board. Percy, who Brett had hired onto the prep team within his first month, singing something indistinct near the walk-in cooler. Brett read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and started working. Because the onions needed to be down in 14 minutes. And the stock had been reducing since 4:30. And there was a table of 8 coming in at 7 that evening, who had requested the tasting menu. And the tasting menu required attention. Later that evening, after service, Victoria asked him how he felt about the Groundwork Series announcement going public. Brett thought about the service entrance on a Tuesday afternoon. The laugh that had bounced off stainless steel. He thought about Jake at 11 years old in a 2-bedroom apartment, sitting across a kitchen table, with a flickering overhead light, telling him to do the thing. He thought about Renata on the floor of an empty dining room, eating takeout, laughing about how insane it was, coming up with the name. Like it was always going somewhere, he said. Even when it didn't look like it. Victoria nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a thing has been said that they were not expecting to feel. Outside, Cincinnati was doing what it does on autumn evenings. Cooling down fast, the river reflecting the bridge lights, the streets going quiet at the edges, while the center stays lit. Inside Hargrove, Percy was finishing up, and Jake was sitting in the corner booth. Brett had quietly made available to him on nights, when he didn't want to go to an empty apartment after school, working through his homework with his notepad open beside him. Jake looked up once, caught his father's eye across the dining room, and gave the slow smile. The one that started in the eyes. Brett had been watching for that exact thing his whole life, without knowing it until now. And it meant the same thing it always had, not perfect, not finished, not without cost, but good. Real and true and good, in the way that only things that were almost lost can be.